Even now, more than 11 centuries later, historians still puzzle over how a frail, bookish boy became one of the most decisive figures in the making of England. His bones have been lost, his grave desecrated multiple times, and the last traces of his resting place vanished under Victorian foundations. Yet the legend of Alfred endures not merely as warrior or scholar, but as the improbable heart of a people who refuse to disappear. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see this little kingdom of night owls around the world. Alfred was born in 849 CE at Wantage in Berkshire, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex and his queen Osber. His early life began under a bright star. Wessex was at that moment the strongest of the Anglo-Saxon realms. Yet from the start, his body betrayed him. Accounts written a generation after his death describe chronic ailments, some believe piles, or a mysterious abdominal disorder that caused him immense pain throughout life. This persistent fragility oddly sharpened his mind and his empathy. When other royal children were trained with sword and shield, Alfred was sent on pilgrimage to Rome at age 4, a diplomatic journey that became spiritual initiation. The Pope himself blessed the little prince, placing a crown upon his head, perhaps as symbolic gesture, perhaps as omen. Those early Roman memories imprinted something lasting, an awareness of order, ceremony, and divine legitimacy. He would carry that awareness into adulthood long after his homeland fell into chaos. The England of Alfred's childhood was not yet one nation, but a mosaic of kingdoms. Wessex in the south, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria and East Anglia in the north and east. Christianity had taken deep root, but the raids of pagan Danes were beginning to darken the horizon. To a boy watching monks copying manuscripts in candlelight, it must have seemed that God's peace could not possibly vanish. But by the time he reached manhood, that peace had become a memory. His mother Osber recognized in Alfred a strange combination of gentleness and drive. The famous story of the poetry book, the one she promised to whichever of her sons could memorize its verses, first captures this perfectly. Alfred, not yet literate, but determined, committed the text to memory and claimed the prize. It was a small domestic scene, but it reveals the forming of a king who would later translate entire treatises himself, believing that ignorance was a national illness. The rhythm of learning the sound of Latin words in his mouth became as natural to him as breathing. When Ethelwulf died in 858, Alfred was 9. His older brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, took the throne one after another, leaving Alfred in a long queue of succession he never expected to reach. During these years, he became a quiet observer of rule. He watched how court factions whispered and schemed, how decisions on tribute and war rippled across villages. His brothers involved him in councils and in the chronicles. His presence is constant, a silent prince accompanying the king, attending synods, perhaps already advising. The line between childhood and kingship in early medieval England was thin. By 15, Alfred had likely already led small contingents in skirmishes. Yet the defining shadow of his youth was not politics, but religion. He prayed incessantly, sometimes through the night, a habit that worried his attendants. Alfred believed divine favor could determine the fate of nations. His faith, however, was never simple piety. It was an instrument of discipline. He fasted, endured illness without complaint, and studied the Psalms as military instruction manuals for the soul. While other rulers sought omens in battle, Alfred found his in Scripture, and this spiritual intensity would later radiate into his governance, his laws, even his battlefield strategies. Behind the young prince's education stood the memory of Rome and a deep awareness of Latin culture. At the time, Wessex was still culturally provincial compared to Frankish Europe. Alfred admired Charlemagne's empire across the Channel and often compared its learning with the intellectual poverty of England. When he later rebuilt education, that sense of inferiority transformed into inspiration. But as a youth, it was still a haunting question. How could a small kingdom of scattered monasteries stand against the organized power of Viking fleets? The answer had not yet appeared. By the mid-860s, Viking armies were growing larger and more permanent. What had begun as raiding bands evolved into colonizing forces. They did not simply steal, they stayed. And as word of burning abbeys reached Winchester, Alfred's understanding of kingship deepened. He was learning what no tutor could teach: how civilizations die. Every monastery destroyed was a library of memory, erased every slain monk, a page torn from England's book. For a boy raised on Latin verse, the thought was unbearable. He grew close to his brother Ethelred, who would later become king, and together they witnessed the arrival of the great heathen army in 865, a coalition of Scandinavian warriors, whose leaders demanded not ransom, but land. It was the apocalypse of Anglo-Saxon politics. Northumbria fell east, Anglia followed, Mercia staggered. Wessex stood next in line. Alfred, now in his late teens, began to shoulder command. His mind, shaped by illness and contemplation, turned to strategy, mobility, fortified refugees, and intelligence networks. Though his first commands were minor, they revealed a capacity for patience unusual among princes. Historians have sometimes framed Alfred as a saintly figure, a scholar lost among warriors. The truth is sharper. His gentleness masked an iron realism. He understood that survival was not guaranteed by valor, but by structure, law, and faith woven together. Even in youth, he was organizing, planning, learning how to turn chaos into order. When chroniclers later called him England's shepherd, they captured something literal: the image of a leader guiding scattered flocks through storms. When Alfred came of age, Wessex was a kingdom encircled by fear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records each year, like a drumbeat of calamity, monasteries, plundered villages, burned kings slain. To the north, the once mighty realms of Northumbria and East Anglia had fallen under the control of the great heathen army, led by men whose names would echo through English nightmares: Halfdan Guthrum, Uber Ivar, the Boneless. Their dragon-proud ships clogged the estuaries like a tide of iron and fire. Each winter, instead of returning home, they stayed building fortresses and planting crops in conquered soil. For the first time, England was not simply being raided, it was being invaded. Alfred's father, Ethelwulf, had once negotiated peace through tribute, but that generation's policy had expired. The Danes were now settlers-conquerors and kings in their own right. Mercia, once Wessex's uneasy ally, was collapsing under pressure. Its famous capital, Repton, fell in 873. By then, Alfred's brother, Ethelred, sat on the throne of Wessex, and Alfred himself served as second in command. He was barely in his 20s, yet his tactical influence was already visible in the kingdom's defense. Every decision was made under siege psychology. Alfred traveled constantly between fortified towns, strengthening garrisons, inspecting supplies, and organizing the FUD, the part-time militia, of free men who formed England's first citizen army. The system was crude, often unreliable, but it was all they had. The Danes moved swiftly. The Anglo-Saxons, bound by harvest and duty, could not always muster in time. The contrast between organized invaders and fragmented defenders haunted Alfred. He was beginning to realize that winning a war required something England had never truly possessed: national unity. In 871, the storm broke. The Vikings launched full-scale attacks on Wessex, striking from Reading. Ethelred and Alfred fought a series of fierce battles at Inglefield Reading, Ashdown Basing, and Merton. The chronicles tell of heroism and exhaustion in equal measure. At Ashdown, Alfred commanded the West Saxon troops on one wing of the battlefield, while Ethelred prayed in his tent, refusing to begin until Mass was finished. It became one of the defining images of Alfred's youth, a man of faith and war, balancing devotion and duty even amid chaos. When the king finally emerged, his men charged, and the Danes were driven back with heavy losses. But the triumph was short-lived. That same year saw devastating counterattacks. Wessex suffered defeat at Basing and again at Merton, where Alfred himself may have been wounded. Ethelred's health began to fail, and within months he was dead. The crown passed to Alfred at an age when most men were only beginning to prove themselves. He was 21, newly married to Elswith of Mercia, and inheriting a kingdom that was bleeding from every border. His coronation took place at Kingston upon Thames, a ceremony shadowed by the smell of smoke from burning villages not far away. The first years of his reign were defined by crisis management. In 871 alone, the chronicle notes 9 major battles. Alfred paid the Danes to withdraw an act, often criticized by later writers as cowardice, but in reality, it was strategy buying time. Wessex could not withstand continuous assault. He needed breathing space to rebuild his armies and study his enemies' methods. Behind the scenes, he began to reform logistics, rotating levies, ensuring supplies for prolonged campaigns, and fortifying key river crossings. His mind, analytical and patient, was constructing the skeleton of a defensive system that would later save England. But the threat was relentless. By 874, the Vikings had taken control of most of Mercia. Guthrum, the formidable Danish leader, set his sights on Wessex itself. Alfred could not match the invaders in numbers, but he was learning adaptability. He relied increasingly on intelligence networks, gathering reports from scouts and informants, an early form of espionage. He studied Viking tactics, their preference for surprise winter assaults, their reliance on fortified camps, their swift mobility. Alfred countered by developing the use of local refugees, church strongholds, and hidden routes through the countryside that allowed his forces to regroup after defeat. The tension reached its breaking point in 878, a year seared into England's collective memory. In midwinter, while most armies lay dormant, Guthrum launched a sudden strike. His forces swept through Wessex, capturing Chippenham and forcing Alfred to flee with only a small band of followers. The king of the West Saxons became a hunted fugitive in his own land. For months, he lived in the marshes of Somerset, taking refuge in the island of Athelney, a soggy, reed-filled wilderness where only the desperate could survive. Later chroniclers turned this episode into legend. One tale tells of Alfred disguised as a peasant, sheltering in a cowherd's hut. When the woman of the house asked him to watch her cakes baking on the fire, the weary king let them burn, lost in thought about his kingdom. She scolded him sharply, not realizing she was rebuking her sovereign. The story may be myth, yet it captures a deeper truth, that in those bleak months, Alfred confronted failure, humility, and the full weight of his people's despair. But Athelney was not exile. It was incubation. Hidden among the reeds, Alfred planned a counteroffensive. He summoned loyal thanes, rebuilt morale, and organized guerrilla raids on Viking patrols. The marsh became a command center, its bogs a natural fortress. The man who once studied Latin poetry now studied survival. He forged alliances with local chieftains, used the rivers as highways for surprise attacks, and prepared the army that would one day face Guthrum in open battle. In the broader context, Alfred's struggle represented the turning point between two ages, the fading tribal kingdoms of the early Saxons, and the emergence of something more centralized, more enduring. The Viking threat, ironically, was forcing the English to think collectively. Every village that sent men to Alfred's cause was acting not just for Wessex, but for the idea of England, though that word was still forming on their tongues. By spring 878, signals spread quietly through the countryside. Alfred's followers gathered at Egbert's Stone, a traditional meeting place on the Downs. Farmers, soldiers, and priests joined him, drawn by rumor that the king still lived. What rose from that gathering was not just an army, but a movement, the rebirth of Wessex from its own ashes. Within weeks, they would march toward Edington, where the fate of England would hang on a single day's battle. But that is a story waiting just beyond the mist of the marshes, where Alfred's endurance transformed into legend, and the long rise of his greatness truly began. When spring broke in 878, the wet winds of the Somerset marshes gave way to a faint promise of rebirth. Alfred emerged from Athelney as if rising from the depths of a long dream, gaunt, resolute, and certain that this moment would decide not only his own survival, but the fate of the entire Saxon people. The messengers he had sent into the countryside returned with pledges of support from nobles and freeholders who had hidden their loyalty in silence during the Viking occupation. They met at Egbert's Stone, the ancient landmark, whose very name evoked Wessex's royal lineage. Farmers left their plows, monks carried relics for blessing, and weary veterans from earlier campaigns reassembled under their rightful king. The army that gathered there was small compared to Guthrum's, but it was unified by desperation. Alfred's leadership had changed during the months of exile, his tone softer, his judgment steadier. He no longer commanded from the throne, but from shared hardship. The men who looked upon him saw not a distant monarch, but one who had suffered beside them, eaten coarse bread, and prayed in flooded marshes. That intimacy forged a new kind of loyalty, born not from oaths, but from belief. The march toward Edington began under grey skies. Alfred's scouts reported that Guthrum's army was entrenched near the village, their confidence high after driving the Saxons into hiding. The Danes, accustomed to victory, likely viewed this new Saxon force as little more than a final nuisance. Yet the king who approached them was no longer the naive commander of earlier defeats. He had studied their patterns, their impatience for plunder, and the overconfidence that came after years of triumph. The battle that followed became one of the most decisive in medieval English history. Chroniclers describe it in few words, but the meaning behind those lines reverberates through centuries. Alfred arranged his men in a shield wall, shoulder-to-shoulder spears, angled forward like a forest of iron. The Danes, expert at this formation themselves, met them head-on. For hours, the two sides clashed in close combat, the sound of metal and shouting echoing across the downs. Accounts suggest that Alfred's men held firm, unusual for armies, that often broke under the ferocity of Viking assault. Perhaps it was hunger, faith, or the memory of their burned homes that steadied their arms. When the Danish line finally faltered, Alfred's troops surged forward. The enemy retreated to their fortress, where they were surrounded and besieged until starvation forced surrender. What followed was not vengeance, but vision. Guthrum was brought before Alfred, expecting execution. Instead, the king offered him baptism and peace. At first, it might seem mere piety, but the gesture was deeply political. By converting Guthrum, Alfred transformed an enemy into an ally bound by Christian law, legitimizing a fragile coexistence. The Treaty of Wedmore soon formalized this peace. The Danes withdrew to territories that would become known as the Danelaw, while Wessex retained the south and west. For the first time in a generation, the horizon of England cleared. The aftermath of Edington marked a psychological turning point. The chroniclers spoke of divine deliverance, but the reality was more complex. Alfred knew the Vikings would not vanish. He had bought time, not safety. Yet in that time, he began constructing the architecture of endurance. The king, who once hid in swamps, now thought in systems, defensive networks, administrative reforms, and spiritual renewal. His vision stretched beyond survival toward reconstruction. His first major project was the fortification of the kingdom. Alfred recognized that scattered villages and unguarded monasteries had made England an easy target. So he began building fortified settlements known as burhs. Each burh was a combination of fortress market and administrative hub, strategically placed so that no Wessex inhabitant was more than 20 miles from refuge. Roads were repaired, river crossings secured, and supply depots established. The burh system transformed defense into geography, a permanent map of resilience carved into the landscape. Yet Alfred's genius extended beyond stone walls. He understood that a kingdom defended by ignorant men was as fragile as one defended by weak soldiers. So he turned his attention to education. He lamented that few could still read Latin, the language of scripture and law. To rebuild learning was to rebuild wisdom, and wisdom was the foundation of just rule. He gathered scholars from Mercia, Wales, and even across the sea, forming a court school at Winchester. There he studied, not merely as patron, but as pupil translating works, like Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Gregory's Pastoral Care, into Old English, so that all might share in their guidance. Alfred's intellectual renaissance did not mean softness. His faith demanded both sword and book. He commissioned the rebuilding of the navy, creating what could be called the first English fleet. Ships were built larger than the Viking longboats, designed to match or outpace them on the rivers and coasts. These vessels, though not always successful, represented a new kind of thinking, one that saw the sea not as a frontier of fear, but as a pathway of defense and trade. Meanwhile, he restructured the legal system. Drawing upon Mosaic law, Roman precedent, and local custom, he produced a code that began with moral precepts before listing punishments. The tone was pastoral rather than punitive laws, intended not only to deter crime, but to instruct conscience. In a world accustomed to arbitrary justice, this blending of mercy and order was revolutionary. Alfred's goal was to make the law an instrument of unity, binding Saxon and Dane alike under shared ethics. While peace held, Wessex began to breathe again. Villages rebuilt, churches reopened, and trade resumed with the continent. Yet scars remained. Many families lived among graves of kin slain in the invasions. The cultural trauma of near annihilation shaped Alfred's policies more than any triumphalism. He insisted that prosperity must never lull the people into complacency. The burrs were reminders that vigilance was permanent, as much a moral duty as a military one. Despite his authority, Alfred remained accessible. Chronicles describe him walking among craftsmen, questioning merchants, and inspecting schools. His humility became a kind of political theater, reinforcing the idea that the king was servant first, sovereign second. In later English political philosophy, this would evolve into the notion of the king as shepherd, a ruler accountable to his flock. As the years following Eddington unfolded, the contrast between Alfred's scholarly projects and his military vigilance revealed a balance rare in any age. His nights were said to be divided into equal thirds, one for study and prayer, one for administration, and one for rest. That rhythm, disciplined yet humane, defined the kingdom he was creating. Out of fear, he was crafting structure. Out of chaos, culture. By the early 880s, Alfred's reputation had spread across the Channel. Frankish scholars compared him to Charlemagne, though on a smaller, more fragile scale. He corresponded with continental monasteries, exchanged gifts with popes, and even sent embassies to Rome and Jerusalem. To his contemporaries, he was not simply a survivor, but a reformer in an age of collapse. And though he still faced illness, those mysterious chronic pains that never left him, he turned suffering into fuel for compassion. In retrospect, Eddington was the pivot of Alfred's rise, the moment a kingdom on the brink of extinction rediscovered its voice. Yet what truly defined his greatness came after the slow, deliberate building of a society that could withstand both war and peace. He had learned that victory without structure was only delay, and that endurance required not only swords, but schools, not only courage, but culture. The boy who once memorized poems to please his mother had grown into a man who made knowledge itself the cornerstone of a nation. The years after Eddington were years of fragile peace stitched together by diplomacy, shared exhaustion, and the cold arithmetic of necessity. Alfred knew Guthrum's conversion to Christianity did not mean the end of Viking ambition. It merely meant that the borderlands between Wessex and the Danelaw were now governed by words instead of swords. Across those new boundaries, trade resumed, and farmers returned to ploughing fields that had lain scorched for decades. Yet even in this calm, Alfred felt the ticking clock of history. He saw that his reign could not simply be about survival. It had to be about renewal. Wessex, once the smallest of the Saxon realms, began to transform under his steady guidance. The burr system expanded with mathematical precision. Each fortress was positioned within a day's march of the next, ensuring rapid mobilization. To man and maintain these defenses, he reorganized the Fyrd, creating a rotation system so that half the army could serve while the other half tended the fields. This innovation, simple, logical, revolutionary, solved the great paradox of early medieval warfare: how to fight without starving. His administrative genius was as crucial as any battle he fought. The burhs were more than fortresses, they were seeds of towns. Around their wooden palisades grew markets, smithies, and workshops. Coins minted in Winchester, and London began to circulate again, bearing Alfred's image, a stern face framed by a simple crown, his eyes not of vanity but vigilance. Through trade and taxation, he unified his people under a shared economy. For the first time, Wessex began to feel like more than a kingdom of shifting loyalties. It began to feel like a country. Meanwhile, Guthrum, ruling East Anglia under the name Ethelstan after his baptism, maintained an uneasy but genuine peace. He died around 890, leaving a vacuum in the Danelaw that younger, hungrier warlords soon filled. Alfred's spies reported renewed fleets, assembling on the coasts of Northumbria and the Frisian shores. He understood that the Vikings' nature could not change as quickly as their names. So he turned again to the sea. The Anglo-Saxons had long feared the water, associating it with invasions and storms, but Alfred saw it differently. The rivers and channels that had carried enemies could also carry defense. He expanded the navy he had begun in the 870s, commissioning ships that were neither purely Saxon nor purely Danish in design, but hybrids of both. Longer, faster, with higher sides for archers, they were the first purpose-built warships in English history. Their crews were composed of both Saxons and experienced Frisian sailors, the first step toward a standing maritime force. With these vessels, Alfred sought to reclaim the coastlines and symbolically England's sense of security. Naval engagements followed. In 882, a Wessex fleet clashed with Danish ships near Kent, achieving mixed success, but proving the concept viable. The chroniclers noted with quiet pride that the king's ships fought on the sea. It was the first time the phrase appeared in the English record, small words marking the birth of a navy that would one day rule oceans. While military reforms secured borders, Alfred's heart turned toward learning. The devastation of the Viking Wars had nearly extinguished literacy in England. Monasteries that once copied Bibles and annals had been reduced to ashes. Few priests could read Latin well enough to interpret scripture, and the administration of justice was faltering because written law had decayed. Alfred viewed this as more dangerous than any army. Wisdom, he wrote in one preface, has decayed from our land. He resolved to restore it. He invited scholars from across the British Isles and the continent, Asser from Wales, Grimbald from Flanders Plegmond, who would later become Archbishop of Canterbury, and others whose names flicker through dusty manuscripts. They gathered at his court in Winchester, forming a circle of intellectual revival. Together, they began translating essential texts into Old English so that even those untrained in Latin could learn. Gregory the Great's pastoral care became a manual for clergy. Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy offered solace and reason to a weary people. Augustine's soliloquies nourished reflection. Alfred himself translated parts of these works, adding personal prefaces that reveal a mind both humble and visionary. He wrote not as a distant monarch, but as a teacher addressing his students, "If we have the means, let us learn, for learning is the surest wall against decline." To him, books were fortresses of the spirit, each one a burr against ignorance. The same king who designed military networks also designed a curriculum for his nation, Education reached beyond monasteries. Alfred promoted literacy among nobles and encouraged the training of clerks to administer law and taxation. He sought to make the written word a tool of governance, a concept radical for its time. Even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that ongoing record of yearly events, owes its continuation to his encouragement. He understood the power of narrative, the way memory could unify a people just as surely as armies could. But not all was peace and parchment. In the early 890s, Viking warbands returned led by a formidable chieftain named Hastin. They landed first in Kent, then struck into Wessex and Mercia. The raids were smaller than the great army of old, but still dangerous. Alfred's reformed defenses proved their worth. The Boers mobilized swiftly. Local forces repelled invaders before they could entrench. At Farnham and Buttington, the West Saxons and Mercians fought together, a sign that the old rivalries between kingdoms were dissolving. The sense of Englishness, once a vague cultural thread, began to solidify through shared resistance. These years also tested Alfred's diplomacy. He maintained correspondence with rulers in Europe, notably the Frankish Emperor Charles the Fat, exchanging gifts and occasionally refugees. His daughter Ethelflaed married Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, forging a powerful alliance between the two realms. This union would later become the cornerstone for the unification of England under their son Edward the Elder and daughter Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians. Amid these alliances, Alfred faced personal burdens. His mysterious illness continued to torment him, flaring unpredictably. Chroniclers describe him withdrawing from court for days, weakened by pain. Yet he never ceased working. Even in sickness, he dictated translations, reviewed fortifications, and planned church endowments. His endurance itself became an unspoken lesson to his people that duty could outlast the body's frailty. By the end of the decade, Wessex had become the most stable realm in the British Isles. The Danelaw held firm in the east, the Welsh respected Alfred's strength, and the Irish chroniclers across the sea called him King of the English. It was the first time such a title had been used, suggesting that the idea of a unified England, though still political fiction, was beginning to take shape. Alfred's rise was no longer simply personal. It was civilizational. By the early 890s, Alfred's Wessex stood at a crossroads. The land had endured invasion, rebuilt itself through order and learning, and now faced the question of endurance. Could a realm born from crisis sustain peace without collapsing into stagnation? The balance between sword and scripture, between vigilance and prosperity, became the defining tension of his final decade. For the first time in a generation, the crops grew unburned trade ships from Francia and Flanders returned to southern ports, and Winchester rang not with alarm bells, but with the sound of hammers rebuilding churches. Yet Alfred's eyes, ever wary, turned north and east, where Viking fleets once again stirred. The new invaders were smaller than the great army that had shattered kingdoms 20 years earlier. But their tactics had evolved. Instead of conquering vast territories, they sought quick plunder, striking undefended coasts and withdrawing to their ships before local garrisons could respond. Alfred's restructured Boer system, however, had changed the game. Each fortress had a fixed garrison and local militia assigned by precise obligation, recorded on parchment lists stored in the royal chancery. When the alarm fires were lit, riders carried signals to the nearest strongholds, and reinforcements arrived within days. The result was a coordination unknown in earlier generations of Saxon warfare. The most dangerous of these late Viking incursions was led by Hastin, a cunning and unpredictable warlord who embodied the new generation of Scandinavian opportunists, part raider, part diplomat, part trickster. Around 892, Hastin's fleet, reinforced by men from the continent, landed in Kent and established fortified camps at Appledore and Milton. The timing was ominous. England was still recovering from famine, and Alfred himself was entering his mid-40s, his health fragile. Yet the kingdom he had built was no longer brittle. His son Edward, already acting as sub-commander, took to the field beside experienced nobles, while Alfred himself oversaw strategy from a network of messengers and fortified camps. The campaigns that followed were not glorious clashes, but a grinding chess match. Hastin's army moved swiftly, plundering along the Thames, and Severn pursued relentlessly by Alfred's combined Wessex-Mercian forces. At Buttington, the raiders found themselves surrounded and starved into surrender, their horses eaten, their escape routes cut. Some chronicles describe English troops singing psalms as they tightened the siege lines, echoing the king's belief that faith and warfare could coexist without contradiction. Alfred's system, fortified towns, mobile levies, river defenses, had done what no individual battle could. It made invasion unprofitable. Even in moments of triumph, Alfred's thoughts returned to the fragility of peace. He saw that stability required moral discipline as much as military strength. To preserve what had been built, he deepened his reforms of law and governance. His legal code, one of the earliest surviving in Europe, to integrate religious Roman and local precedent, aimed to create a society that judged actions not merely by punishment, but by intent. It began with the 10 Commandments and continued with pragmatic clauses about property inheritance and compensation for injury, an elegant balance between divine principle and earthly necessity. He wrote that justice should bind hearts as walls bind cities, suggesting that moral cohesion was the true defense of a nation. His courts, presided over by reeves and local ealdormen, were instructed to record cases in writing. This practice, humble in origin, planted the first roots of English legal literacy. Every time a priest or scribe copied a verdict, the habit of written governance grew stronger. Alfred's England was becoming not just a land of fortresses, but a land of documents where ink and oath worked together to keep order. While Alfred labored over the mechanics of law, his cultural vision continued to unfold. He saw learning as a form of worship and literacy as a duty of leadership. At Winchester, his scholars produced a remarkable burst of translation and composition. They recopied the pastoral care, the dialogues of Gregory, and the consolation of philosophy. In each, Alfred's prefaces spoke directly to future generations, urging them to preserve knowledge so that ignorance could never again make them vulnerable. The tone of these writings was intimate, almost fatherly, revealing a man aware that his own lifetime was limited and that the survival of wisdom must outlive his breath. By now his children were grown. Edward, the eldest son, proved disciplined and strategic, serving beside him in campaigns. His daughter Ethelfled, married to Ethelred of Mercia, governed with such ability that chroniclers later called her Lady of the Mercians. Another daughter, Elfthryth, was sent to marry Baldwin II of Flanders, cementing alliances across the Channel. Through these marriages and partnerships, Alfred wove a network that stretched beyond Wessex, binding the fragmented Anglo-Saxon world into the early pattern of what would become England. His private life, however, remained shadowed by illness. Contemporary sources describe him enduring chronic pain, perhaps Crohn's disease, perhaps severe hemorrhoids, or something still undiagnosed by modern medicine. Whatever the cause, it plagued him from youth until death. Asser, his Welsh biographer, wrote that Alfred's suffering was known only to God, yet it deepened his patience and humility. Instead of retreating, he used his nights of sleeplessness for prayer and reflection, shaping ideas that bridged faith and policy. In those hours, he dictated revisions to translations or whispered commands to scribes, by candlelight, turning pain into productivity. One of Alfred's subtler achievements was his diplomacy with the Welsh. Unlike earlier Saxon rulers who viewed the Western kingdoms as rivals, Alfred treated them as partners. He offered gifts to the kings of Dyfed, and Gwynedd exchanged hostages peacefully and allowed Welsh scholars into his court. These relationships stabilized his western frontier and strengthened his intellectual circle, proof that even small gestures of respect could reshape centuries of hostility. The late 890s also brought growing contact with the continent. Carolingian Europe, once dominant, was fracturing under internal strife, and refugees sought the stability of Wessex. Monks fleeing Norse raids in Francia arrived with manuscripts and relics. Alfred welcomed them, using their skills to enrich English scholarship. In this way, his court became a rare beacon of order amid Europe's crumbling imperial remnants, a small, unlikely heir to the legacy of Rome. Through these years of reconstruction, Alfred continued refining his system of time and administration. He reportedly divided the day by means of burning candles, marked in measured sections, using them to regulate his prayers and royal duties. It was a practical metaphor for his philosophy that life, like light, must be portioned wisely before it burns away. To a weary kingdom emerging from darkness, such discipline seemed almost saintly. By 899, Alfred had ruled for nearly 3 decades. The boy who once memorized verses in his mother's hall had become a philosopher king revered across Christendom. Yet he remained curiously modest. He forbade grand titles, calling himself simply King of the West Saxons. Only in foreign correspondence did he sometimes allow the phrase King of the Anglo-Saxons, acknowledging quietly what he had already achieved, the first stable foundation of an English realm. As his health declined, he withdrew more often to Winchester, surrounded by his children and scholars. The Viking raids had subsided, the burghs stood strong, the schools thrived. The peace he had dreamed of was at last tangible. Yet he never mistook it for permanence. He told Edward that peace without vigilance was illusion, and that every generation must rebuild its own walls, both literal and moral. When he died in October 899, perhaps at 50 or 51, the grief that spread through his kingdom was mixed with awe. No English king before him had left such a complete design, a network of fortresses, schools, laws, and alliances that could survive the vacuum of his passing. His body was buried at Winchester, though centuries later, his bones would be moved lost and mythologized, as if even death could not quite contain him. Alfred's death in 899 was more than the passing of a king. It was the testing of a system. The realm he had built now stood without its architect, its peace dependent on the endurance of institutions instead of the charisma of one man. Across Wessex, bells tolled and psalms echoed through the burhs. He had designed their churches filled with citizens who had only known one monarch in their adult lives. His body lay first in Winchester's Old Minster, later moved to the New Minster. He had found it then again and again through the centuries until all trace was lost. But his true monument remained in the living machinery of the kingdom, the fortresses, schools, and laws that bore his imprint long after the marble crumbled. His son Edward ascended the throne, continuing the work with the calm competence his father had instilled. Yet in these early years of transition, the memory of Alfred remained everywhere, a moral weight, a standard that none could ignore. Even foreign chroniclers, who had once dismissed the Saxons as backwater tribes, now wrote of the wisdom of the sons of Alfred. His legacy radiated outward like ripples in a pond, reshaping the island's destiny. To understand the full measure of Alfred's rise, one must see how his reforms transcended his lifetime. The burh system evolved into a framework of local governance that survived into the medieval shire system. Each burh became the nucleus of a town: Oxford, Wallingford, Wareham, Winchester, all tracing their civic DNA to his defensive network. Where once there were wooden palisades and watchtowers, there now stood markets courts and councils. The idea that a king's responsibility extended beyond warfare to the organized welfare of daily life became an enduring English principle. Meanwhile, the educational revival he had begun quietly seeded an intellectual renaissance. Within a generation, monasteries from Glastonbury to Abingdon were again producing manuscripts. The copying of texts in Old English, initiated under Alfred's orders, preserved knowledge through linguistic transition. Had it not been for his insistence on vernacular learning, much of early Christian literature might have vanished from England entirely. His translations became templates for the English written tradition, linking language with governance, faith, and identity. But his legacy was not purely institutional, it was psychological. Before Alfred, the Anglo-Saxons had thought of themselves as a mosaic of tribes: West Saxons, Mercians, Northumbrians, East Anglians. After him, the concept of English began to carry a new meaning, a shared identity beyond local allegiance. This subtle transformation, forged through war and wisdom alike, was the foundation upon which Edward and his sister Ethelfled would build the dream of unification. Alfred had not proclaimed an English nation, but he had prepared its soul. In his lifetime, that unity had been fragile. The Vikings were still entrenched in the Danelaw, their settlements stretching from the Humber to East Anglia. The treaties Alfred signed were pragmatic, not idealistic lines drawn between exhaustion and endurance. But within those boundaries, his administration cultivated a society sturdy enough to absorb and eventually transform its former enemies. Many Danes in Wessex adopted Christian names, married local women, and became indistinguishable from their neighbors. Alfred's policy of inclusion, judging men by oath and conduct rather than blood, allowed assimilation rather than endless vendetta. His England would not be purely Saxon, but hybrid, a fusion of warrior cultures tempered by law and learning. Even centuries later, this capacity to absorb invaders rather than annihilate them would define the English character. The memory of Alfred's reign, its combination of resilience, mercy, and intellect, became a mythic standard invoked by kings who barely resembled him. Medieval chroniclers in the age of the Normans looked back to Alfred as the ideal Rex Justus, the just king who balanced sword and scripture humility and power. Monks wrote that his candle clocks had symbolized his very soul divided with mathematical precision between prayer study and duty. In an era when rulers lived for conquest, he had lived for preservation. His reign also reshaped the role of the church. Before Alfred, ecclesiastical authority often stood apart from royal governance. After him, the two were intertwined. He viewed faith as the scaffolding of order. The bishops he appointed were not merely theologians, but administrators, responsible for education, law, and welfare. His collaboration with Plegmond, whom he elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury, redefined the relationship between crown and church as mutual guardianship rather than competition. It was this partnership, spiritual and practical, that kept England stable when other European realms disintegrated under Viking pressure. Alfred's use of written law further solidified his influence across centuries. The preamble to his Doom Book, the earliest English legal code of such scope, framed justice as divine stewardship. King Alfred gathered and considered the laws of our forefathers, and those which I judged most right I kept, and others I rejected. This selective continuity created a precedent that future English kings would follow evolution rather than revolution reform rooted in memory. From that principle would eventually grow the common law tradition with its careful layering of precedent and interpretation. His reign's influence stretched even into the rhythms of daily life. The system of taxation, the reeve's duties, the division of hundreds and tithings, all owed their origin or refinement to his administration. His insistence on record-keeping gave the English a bureaucratic identity, long before such systems became standard in Europe. He transformed kingship from personal heroism into structured stewardship, a quiet revolution that made the English state unusually durable. Yet beyond these tangible reforms, Alfred's most haunting legacy was moral. His biographer Asser wrote that he never despaired of the mercy of God, even when the whole kingdom despaired of him. That line, often quoted through the centuries, captures the essence of his rise perseverance without self-deception. He never claimed divine right. Instead, he viewed his rule as service a fragile mandate renewed daily through labor and faith. In the imagination of later generations, Alfred's image softened into legend. Children learned tales of the burnt cakes and the hidden king in the marshes. Bards sang of him as England's light, the ruler who rose from exile to restore order. Even as Europe's great empires crumbled and new dynasties rose, the story of the king who built a nation from a swamp endured. But perhaps the most profound testament to his legacy lies in silence, in the enduring calm of the English countryside that still bears his mark. The layout of ancient market towns, the faint ring shapes of old burghs visible from the air, the persistence of local councils, all whisper the memory of a man who believed that structure could outlast chaos. When modern historians trace the roots of England's continuity through centuries of invasion and reform, they always arrive back at the same figure, Alfred of Wessex, who refused to let the island forget itself. Alfred's reign ended with stability, but its true continuation unfolded in the decades that followed. His son, Edward the Elder, inherited not merely a crown, but an unfinished mission to secure the borders, absorb the Danelaw, and ensure that the fragile concept of England did not dissolve once the founder's steady hand was gone. Alfred had built the foundation. Now his descendants would test whether it could bear the weight of a united realm. But though Edward's story rightly belongs to another chronicle, the final years of Alfred's own life remain essential for understanding how his rise became permanent. The closing chapter of Alfred's career revealed the fullest integration of mind law and faith. His government reached a level of organization unprecedented among the Anglo-Saxons. From Winchester radiated an administration that combined royal oversight with local autonomy. Each ealdorman commanded both civil and military authority in his region. But Alfred ensured they answered to written orders rather than oral tradition. He used messengers and royal writs, sealed with crosses, extending a new sense of legitimacy, rooted not in lineage alone, but in recorded law. This bureaucratic instinct, meticulous, almost modern, was perhaps his most underrated talent. He also restructured taxation in ways subtle but profound. The ancient trinoda, necessitas, the three obligations of military service, fortress work, and bridge repair, was refined under his reign into a predictable system of public duty. Instead of arbitrary levies, obligations were now proportional to landholdings, establishing fairness where once there had been feudal improvisation. Every farmer, every thegn, understood what was owed and to whom. It was a small revolution in governance, turning loyalty from a personal bond into a civic contract. In culture, Alfred's literary project flourished until his final years. The scholars at Winchester continued to produce manuscripts, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun under his patronage, expanded to include not only battles and deaths, but reflections on God's purpose in history. This was not just record-keeping, it was identity-building. For the first time, an English people saw their own story unfolding in their own tongue. The chronicle's tone, simple and direct, mirrored Alfred's own voice, steady, pragmatic, humble. Through it, he achieved what few rulers have ever done. He wrote his people into existence. Beyond administration and letters, Alfred's influence on the moral landscape of his age was transformative. His belief that kingship was service rather than privilege infused every act of governance. When famine struck or floods ruined harvests, he released royal grain stores and ordered equitable redistribution. When monasteries requested land, he reviewed charters, personally ensuring both fairness and accountability. His concept of stewardship reflected a distinctly Christian humanism, rare for his time, the notion that power existed to heal, not merely to command. His court became a microcosm of this philosophy. Visitors from across Europe commented on its balance of dignity and simplicity. While the Frankish courts glittered with gold and indulgence, Alfred's was noted for its quiet discipline. Meals were modest. Conversation mixed theology, law, and poetry. Guests described the king discussing the nature of justice as easily as he discussed naval design. That harmony between intellect and practicality defined him. Even his military reforms carried the stamp of a mind that saw pattern in all things time, divided by candles, armies divided by rotation duties, measured like verses in a psalm. Yet the physical strain of such unending labor grew visible. By the mid-890s, his ailments became severe enough to confine him for weeks at a time. Asser recorded that often he groaned in pain, but ceased not from prayer or thought. He bore illness as another campaign patient, strategic, unwelcome, but endurable. It was said he measured his strength in hours and used them fully, believing that each moment of consciousness was borrowed from God. The legend of Alfred's sleeplessness, his nights spent reading, planning, or dictating, may well stem from these long, painful vigils. One of his last public acts was the dedication of the new minster at Winchester, intended as a royal mausoleum for his dynasty and a center for learning and liturgy. Its foundation charter expressed the same tone as his translations, gratitude mixed with realism. He wrote that he had built it for the health of my soul and for the peace of the realm. That pairing private salvation and public order summed up his life's work. To Alfred, the health of the soul and the peace of the realm were not separate pursuits. They were one. The new minster became both a symbol and a sanctuary. There monks prayed daily for the king's soul and for the endurance of his kingdom. Its bells marked time for Winchester's citizens, mingling faith and routine. The city itself, reshaped by Alfred's designs, grew into a living testament to his administrative vision. Grid-like streets, fortified perimeters, and markets aligned with the cathedral's rhythm. Winchester under Alfred was both fortress and school sword, and pen balanced in architectural form. As his final illness deepened, Alfred spoke often of his children. He encouraged Edward to rule firmly but justly, reminding him that mercy was a weapon stronger than fear. To his daughters, he left examples of education and diplomacy rather than riches. His correspondence with continental rulers slowed, but his influence abroad did not fade. Continental chroniclers, writing in Latin, began referring to him as Alfredus Magni Alfred the Great, a title he never claimed for himself, but which history refused to retract. In those last months, Wessex remained at peace. The Viking fleets of Hustine had withdrawn, the burhs stood silent and strong, and the harvest was plentiful. The king's presence, though waning in body, lingered in the rhythm of governance itself. The courtiers who attended him described a strange serenity, the sense that the realm for once could continue without panic. He had made himself unnecessary, an achievement rare among monarchs. When death came in October 899, it came quietly. Chroniclers recorded no dramatic final words, only the solemn processions that followed. The people mourned not only a ruler, but the end of an age of clarity. The candle that had measured his days burned out at last, yet its light remained reflected in every fortress school and prayer he had set in motion. His burial at Winchester drew pilgrims from across the island, men and women who owed their safety, their literacy, or their very identity to the system he had built. Centuries later, his bones would be disturbed, moved, perhaps lost altogether, an irony almost poetic for a man whose true remains were never physical. His England lived on, reshaped but unbroken, surviving the storms of conquest and reformation to come. The Norman kings, who later remade the island in their image, would still invoke his name as the measure of just kingship. When they founded schools, codified laws, or raised cathedrals, they were, whether they admitted it or not, working in the shadow of Alfred. Long after Alfred's passing, the framework he had built endured like a living organism, adapting to each new generation's needs. The burhs remained vigilant under Edward the Elder and his formidable sister, Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, who together expanded Alfred's system northward. The Viking strongholds that had once marked the edge of chaos became the very stepping stones toward unity. In the peaceful intervals between wars, these fortified towns evolved into civic centers, places of trade law and governance, cementing the social fabric Alfred had woven. Each stone, each market, toll, each council meeting still carried the pulse of his intention that stability must be sustained not by charisma, but by structure. Edward inherited both the discipline and the caution of his father. Under his rule, the burst system expanded in scale and sophistication. He added new fortresses along the Danelaw frontier, Bedford, Malden, Stamford, each manned by a garrison whose rotations were calculated with the same precision Alfred had introduced. His campaigns against Viking lords in East Anglia and the Midlands were not merely military expeditions. They were acts of integration, drawing conquered territories into the legal and administrative orbit of Wessex. The strategy that began in Alfred's marshes had evolved into a blueprint for conquest through endurance rather than annihilation. Ethelfled, ruling Mercia after her husband's death, governed with intelligence and restraint. Chronicles describe her as her father's equal in wisdom, a woman who commanded loyalty without needing to prove her authority through violence. Her fortifications mirrored Alfred's designs, but often improved upon them, showing how his architectural vision had become a hereditary language of defense. Together, Edward and Ethelfled executed the final phase of what Alfred had imagined, but never lived to see the reclamation of all southern England from the Danelaw and the gradual knitting of Anglo-Saxon identity into one cloth. While the political landscape transformed, the cultural memory of Alfred began to crystallize into legend. The generation born after his death knew him not as a frail scholar, but as the archetype of divine kingship. Monks wrote hymns comparing him to biblical figures, David for his psalms, Solomon for his wisdom, Moses for leading his people through the wilderness. The image of the king in exile among the marshes became the central parable of English endurance, a nation's spirit preserved in obscurity, waiting for its rightful rebirth. Yet the legends, though softened by piety, were grounded in a practical truth. The structures he had created were visibly succeeding. Markets thrived along trade routes, once ruined by war. The learning he had revived at Winchester spread through new monastic centers. Literacy in Old English reached levels unknown before his reign, and even minor nobles began keeping written charters and wills. The act of writing, the quiet practice Alfred had viewed as a moral duty, was becoming a national habit. The growth of law and record had another consequence. It standardized authority. No longer could local thegns claim arbitrary power without documentation. The law codes Alfred had established, refined under Edward, became references for judgment in shire courts. Written oaths and recorded verdicts replaced vendettas and rumor. In effect, Alfred had domesticated justice. The concept that disputes could be resolved through procedure rather than blood was revolutionary, and within 2 generations, it had become so normal that few remembered the chaos that preceded it. At the same time, the moral tone of his rule continued to resonate. Alfred's vision of kingship as service inspired a new style of leadership in the early 10th century. The Wessex rulers who followed him emphasized continuity rather than conquest, portraying themselves as custodians of peace rather than lords of war. Coins bore inscriptions like Rex Anglorum, King of the English, reflecting both confidence and humility. The phrase implied unity, but avoided boasting, just as Alfred had avoided grand titles in his own time. Meanwhile, across the sea, Europe was fracturing under feudalization. The Carolingian Empire, once a vast network of Christian order, splintered into competing duchies. Viking duchies like Normandy arose in its wake, showing that Alfred's blend of pragmatism and faith was far from universal. England's relative cohesion during this turmoil seemed miraculous to continental observers. Frankish writers described it as an island governed by wisdom, guarded by learning. Such words might have pleased Alfred had he lived to hear them. Domestically, the prosperity he had nurtured allowed for new construction. Stone churches replaced wooden ones, monasteries expanded their scriptoria, and towns like Winchester and London became centers of trade and administration. Alfred's reforms of coinage and measurement persisted, allowing merchants to operate across regions with consistency. These practicalities, coin stalls, weights, and measures, were the hidden arteries of the kingdom binding distant communities through commerce. Every transaction was, in a sense, a whisper of Alfred's ongoing governance, but even as his legacy flourished, it was subtly transformed by memory. Later, chroniclers eager to sanctify his reign exaggerated its miracles and softened its contradictions. They portrayed him as unfailingly gentle, omitting the ruthlessness sometimes required to preserve his order. Yet the true Alfred was neither saint nor tyrant. He had been a realist who understood that compassion without structure collapses just as law without mercy corrodes. His genius lay in balancing the two until they became indistinguishable. The idea of the bourg, for instance, transcended its military origins and evolved into a civic ideal. The fortified settlement became the template for towns that valued self-governance and local identity. Centuries later, when England's boroughs developed charters of freedom and parliamentary voices, they would trace their ancestry consciously, or not to Alfred's urban vision. Each wall and street grid built in his era contained the germ of municipal democracy. Meanwhile, the spiritual culture he cultivated continued to mature. The monasteries he had revived became nurseries of learning for generations of scholars. By the 11th century, England produced its own theologians, poets, and chroniclers who cited Alfred as both founder and muse. In their manuscripts, his image appeared with open book and sword symbols of balance between intellect and defense. Even the illuminated initials in those manuscripts often carried subtle tributes. Candles drawn in margins, representing both his candle clocks and the steady light of knowledge he had kindled. Through all of this, one truth persisted. Alfred's greatness was cumulative. No single act defined him. Rather, it was the sum of his consistent restraint, curiosity, and patience. His was a slow revolution, one measured in decades of quiet administration rather than bursts of conquest. And because it was slow, it lasted. When Edward finally united Wessex Mercia and East Anglia under one rule, he was completing the circle his father had drawn. The phrase England began appearing in documents not as aspiration but as fact. The dream that had begun in a swamp among reeds and fugitives had become a realm stretching from the Channel to the Humber. Alfred had not lived to see it, yet every brick of that unification was mortared with his design. As the 10th century unfolded, Alfred's cultural revolution, his rebirth of learning translation and moral law, became inseparable from the kingdom's stability. Yet his influence stretched even further, reaching beyond the burhs and fortifications into the minds of those who ruled after him. The age of constant invasion was giving way to an age of reflection. The fear that once defined Wessex now evolved into memory, and memory into purpose. Alfred's son Edward and his grandchildren would govern from the world his father had built. But the blueprint of their rule, the harmony of faith order and education, remained distinctly Alfredian. The scholarly revival that began in Winchester spread like light through monasteries newly rebuilt from ruins. Glastonbury, Abingdon, and Malmesbury flourished again as centers of theology and history. Monks trained in the schools Alfred had fostered now copied texts with methodical precision, standardizing handwriting and language. The West Saxon dialect that Alfred used for translations gradually became the written norm across the island. For the first time, England shared not only a king, but a tongue, a literary and administrative unity that made governance itself more coherent. The pen sharpened in Alfred's time had outlived the sword. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle continued under Edward and Ethelstan was the clearest expression of this transformation. What began as Alfred's project to record the deeds of our ancestors had evolved into a national mirror, a chronicle that tracked not just battles but plagues, eclipses, and the foundations of churches. In every entry, one hears the faint echo of Alfred's belief that knowledge was preservation. The chroniclers wrote in a tone of calm confidence, absent from earlier desperate years. They described a people who now saw themselves as custodians of order, not fugitives from chaos. This new confidence allowed England to look outward again. Under Ethelstan, Alfred's grandson, England's influence reached Scotland and Wales. Its kings corresponded with emperors on the continent. The unity Alfred had envisioned in spirit was now visible in geography. The royal seals bore Latin inscriptions calling Ethelstan King of the English and of all Britain, a title that would have seemed unthinkable when Alfred hid in the marshes of Somerset. But beneath every triumph of that later age lay the foundation stones laid by Alfred literacy administration and faith woven together in a single design. While the kingdom flourished, Alfred's personal writings and translations continued to guide the moral imagination of the clergy and court. His prefaces, simple conversational, filled with humility, were copied into manuscripts centuries later as models of Christian kingship. He had never written to glorify himself, but to instruct his successors. In one letter, he lamented how wisdom has faded from our land, a line often repeated by later reformers whenever learning again declined. To read Alfred was to be reminded that neglect, not invasion, was a nation's greatest enemy. The pastoral care, one of his favorite translations, circulated through parish priests as a handbook for moral leadership. It taught that rulers, like shepherds, must guide their flocks with patience and discernment, correcting but never crushing. These ideas filtered quietly into England's developing political consciousness. The later concept of the king in council, a ruler accountable to both God and wise advisers, owed much to Alfred's model of cooperative governance. Even Magna Carta, centuries later, would echo this ethos in its demand that the king be subject to law rather than above it. Alfred had sown those seeds without knowing their eventual bloom. His impact on theology was equally lasting. The scholars he gathered at Winchester carried his insistence on vernacular preaching into the heart of English Christianity. Sermons began to be written in plain English, accessible to lay listeners. This democratization of understanding, radical for its time, bridged the divide between clergy and people. Alfred's belief that truth should not be hoarded in Latin manuscripts but shared in common speech quietly shifted the balance of religious power, making the English church more local, more humane, and less dependent on continental intermediaries. Beyond literacy, the domestic culture he encouraged the disciplined use of time, the blending of devotion and practicality shaped English habits for generations. His candle-measured hours became metaphors for order itself. In monastic rules, household instructions, and even agricultural calendars, echoes of Alfred's timekeeping appear. Farmers marked their ploughing seasons by feast days standardized under his calendar reforms. Abbots organized monastic life into balanced intervals of labor study and prayer. The rhythms of an entire society subtly followed the tempo of a king who had once divided his day by wax and flame. Even the aesthetic of Alfred's age, its simplicity, its clarity, became part of England's identity. The architecture of his churches avoided excess ornament, favoring clean lines and functional design. The manuscripts illuminated in his scriptoria emphasized legibility over luxury. It was as if the nation had internalized his temperament, humble, precise, and purposeful. Later ages, in their cycles of opulence and decline, would look back on Alfred's reign as an age of purity, a time when the kingdom's wealth lay not in gold but in order. However, the shadow of Viking threat never entirely vanished. Raids resumed sporadically along the coasts even after decades of peace. Yet by then, England was no longer fragile. The defenses Alfred had built were permanent fixtures of landscape in mind. When later kings repelled new invasions, they did so using systems he had invented: the network of burhs, the rotating fyrd, the central taxation for defense. Every victory thereafter, even those under distant descendants, was an echo of his original recovery from the marshes. In the 12th century, when historians like William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon compiled grand narratives of England's past, they treated Alfred as the hinge between darkness and civilization. They called him the candle of the English, the restorer of learning, the father of kings. His story became the moral heart of English historiography, a reassurance that wisdom could triumph over ruin. Schoolboys in monastic classrooms copied his name alongside Latin maxims. His example was taught as proof that intellect could be holy, but the truth beneath the legend remained human. Alfred had not been a miracle worker. He had been a man who refused to yield to despair. His strength came not from divine favor alone, but from discipline. The daily choice to keep building when the world seemed intent on collapsing. That realism, wrapped in faith, became the enduring temperament of his people. The English, who would survive invasions by Normans, wars with France, and centuries of upheaval, inherited from him the habit of patient reconstruction. By the dawn of the 11th century, England had transformed from the patchwork of Alfred's youth into a cohesive realm recognized across Europe. Foreign visitors marveled at its order: the maintained roads, the fortified towns, the literate clergy, the currency consistent across shires. What they witnessed was not merely prosperity, but the maturity of a national character. The calm endurance that defined Alfred himself had become the nation's defining trait. His tomb, by then already moved, once became a site of pilgrimage. Kings came to pray for wisdom. Scholars copied his writings as talismans of guidance. Centuries later, when his bones were scattered by time and reconstruction, the idea of Alfred remained intact. His physical body was lost, but his pattern, his slow, deliberate architecture of civilization, was everywhere. From the laws of property to the tone of sermons, from the grids of old towns to the cadence of the English tongue, he remained omnipresent. The foundations Alfred laid continued to ripple outward long after his dynasty gave way to others. His legal reforms, his insistence on the equality of justice, and his view that a king's duty was service before privilege echoed across centuries. To understand his full rise, one must look not only at what he achieved in his lifetime, but at the quiet revolutions that stemmed from his philosophy, revolutions of thought, of structure, and of the moral imagination. They turned Wessex from a survival story into the seed of a civilization. The legal reforms alone were transformative. Before Alfred, Anglo-Saxon law was a loose patchwork of customs and precedents unevenly applied across kingdoms. Disputes often ended in feud or guild, a payment to settle blood debts, but lacked consistency. Alfred's genius lay in codifying without suffocating. His Doom Book did not impose an alien system. It refined existing customs under the moral guidance of Scripture. The law must protect the weak, he wrote, echoing Mosaic tradition while grounding it in English soil. His blending of divine principle with pragmatic enforcement made justice an act of moral governance rather than arbitrary vengeance. Within this framework, he redefined kingship. Where earlier rulers had seen law as an extension of their personal will, Alfred viewed himself as the servant of justice, not its source. In his prefaces, he wrote of seeking counsel from the wise, a subtle but profound statement that the authority of the crown was consultative. In an age where most kings ruled by sword and decree, Alfred ruled by persuasion and precedent. His court became a prototype for future councils, foreshadowing the advisory bodies that would evolve into the English Parliament. The principle that governance required collective wisdom rather than solitary command began here in the calm chambers of Winchester, among scholars and clerks bent over parchment. Economically, his impact was equally enduring. The coinage reform he initiated stabilized the value of silver pennies, creating a unified currency across Wessex and later across England. Coins bore his name, and often simple Christian crosses, linking economic trust to divine order. The reliability of this system fueled commerce and taxation alike. Merchants could travel from Kent to Devon without changing currency, a quiet revolution that underpinned the growth of towns, the predictability of trade, the security of roads, the fairness of tolls. Each sprang from Alfred's conviction that wealth should circulate under moral discipline. The social structure he shaped, though still feudal in its bones, carried hints of modernity. He recognized the mutual dependency of classes then ceorl and serf, and sought to formalize their obligations in law rather than leave them to custom. The result was a society where even the humblest freemen had recognized rights, including access to courts. His laws declared that no man should suffer injustice because of rank, a radical idea for a world still accustomed to hereditary privilege. He could not abolish inequality, but he tempered it with accountability. Religion, too, bore his reforming hand. The clergy of his time had been decimated by decades of war and moral decay. Alfred restored monasteries, endowed bishoprics, and required clerics to be literate. His pastoral care became not only a spiritual guide, but an administrative manual. He believed that ignorant priests produced ignorant congregations, and ignorant congregations produced weak kingdoms. By linking moral education to national defense, he made learning a form of piety. This notion that knowledge was both sacred and civic became an English hallmark for centuries. His influence extended beyond borders. Continental scholars admired his humility and corresponded with his successors, seeking to understand how a small island kingdom had achieved such balance amid chaos. To the Franks, still reeling from internal division, Alfred's England seemed impossibly stable. They saw in him the rare union of philosopher and ruler, reminiscent of the ancients they studied but seldom emulated. His name entered continental annals as Alfredus Philosophus Rex, the philosopher king. The more one studies his reign, the clearer it becomes that Alfred's rise was not a single ascent, but a spiral, each circle of reform feeding another. His educational programs strengthened administration. His administration funded defense. His defense protected learning. The interplay of intellect and practicality created a feedback loop of progress. When later generations referred to the miracle of England's endurance, they were describing this system, a society self-sustaining because it was self-aware. Yet for all his structural brilliance, Alfred's greatest legacy may have been emotional. He gave his people permission to believe in recovery. The Anglo-Saxons of the 9th century had seen cities burned, churches plundered, and entire kingdoms erased. To them, history must have seemed like a descending spiral of ruin. Alfred reversed that psychology. Through patience and law, through candles and councils, he taught them that civilization could be rebuilt slowly, deliberately, and with dignity. He replaced fatalism with stewardship. The stories that survived him, of burnt cakes of secret exile, of his learning in candlelight, were not trivial folklore. They were moral allegories encoded for endurance. Each tale reminded future generations that greatness was not born in ease, but in perseverance. The image of the humble king, scolded by a peasant woman for neglecting her bread, humanized authority. It taught humility to power and patience to the powerless. Such myths carried the moral DNA of his rule better than any decree. Over time, this moral legacy became national character. English chroniclers, monks, and later poets saw in Alfred the origin of their sense of self, practical, reflective, resilient. He was invoked during invasions, reformations, and revolutions as a reminder of what endurance looked like. When the Norman kings sought to legitimize their rule, they claimed Alfred as spiritual ancestor. When Reformation thinkers argued for vernacular scripture, they cited his translations. Even in the Enlightenment, scholars praised him as the first modern man for his union of intellect and governance. Archaeologists and historians still debate his physical relics, his lost bones, his true resting place. But in a sense, Alfred's essence was never material. It was systemic, invisible, and enduring. Every time England reasserted order after chaos, it was repeating his rise. The candle he lit in the 9th century burned through the centuries, its light refracted through parchment law and memory. As the tide of Alfred's influence moved into the 11th century, it became clear that his legacy had transcended the boundaries of his lifetime. His descendants ruled a more cohesive, literate, and organized kingdom than any of their ancestors could have imagined. But what truly defined his rise was not the stability of his dynasty. It was the idea that governance itself could be moral architecture. The same calm wisdom that guided him through marsh and exile continued to echo in the tone of laws, in the layout of towns, and even in the rhythm of prayer that marked English life. Under his successors, particularly, Athelstan England reached heights Alfred had only dreamed of. The patchwork of old kingdoms had been unified under a single crown. The burhs he designed had become thriving market towns, and the clergy he educated now produced scholars recognized throughout Europe. Alfred's vision of a literate and lawful nation was becoming real. His name was invoked in charters as the learned king, not merely to honor him, but to remind future rulers of their duties. The memory of his marshland struggle had already become moral myth, a quiet warning that the strength of kingship came from humility before law. It is here in this inheritance that the deeper layers of Alfred's rise become visible. His philosophy of rule was cyclical rather than linear. He had built systems not for a single lifetime, but for repetition, for adaptation, in ages he would never see. Each time England faced new trials, the mechanisms he left behind reawakened the burghs against invaders, the schools against ignorance, the laws against corruption. The nation had learned resilience as reflex, and that reflex traced back to him. The moral foundation he established endured most visibly in law. His Doom Book had served as a synthesis of Mosaic commandments, Christian ethics, and Saxon custom. Its spirit continued to guide the laws of Edward and the laws of Ethelred. The core principle, justice balanced by mercy, survived each rewriting. Even when later kings punished harshly, the chroniclers recorded regret, invoking Alfred's example as the gentler path. He had become the silent conscience of the English crown. The church, too, remained shaped by his influence. The reforms that insisted on literate clergy and pastoral accountability created a generation of monks and bishops who understood their power as service. The monasteries Alfred had re-endowed flourished in the 10th century, preserving ancient manuscripts and generating new theological works. By the time of the Benedictine Reform, under Dunstan Ethelwald, and Oswald Alfred's insistence on education had already set the stage. These reformers, often cited as the saviors of English spirituality, were in truth heirs of Alfred's scholarly piety. Their monastic schools, liturgical precision, and architectural order were the flowering of seeds he had sown in the 880s. But perhaps the most profound continuation of Alfred's rise was psychological. The English had learned through him to see identity as a moral vocation. Being English no longer meant simply sharing blood or land. It meant participating in a shared discipline of law, faith, and learning. This was a radical shift in an age still defined by lineage and tribalism. Alfred had replaced ethnicity with ethos. In his world, a man's worth was measured by his oath, his education, and his obedience to order. Centuries later, when England confronted Normans, Plantagenets, and Tudors, this sense of identity would persist, flexible yet unbroken. The cultural echo of his reign also endured through language. Alfred's translations, especially of Boethius and Gregory's pastoral care, influenced the style of English prose for centuries. Their clarity, humility, and rhythm shaped how later writers thought in English. Even when Latin reasserted dominance under Norman rule, the pulse of Alfred's language lingered beneath it. When the English tongue re-emerged in the 14th century under Chaucer, its cadence still carried traces of Alfred's quiet moral syntax. He had given his people a literary conscience that no conquest could erase. The architecture of his reign, its physical manifestations, continued to stand as symbols of his mind. The burghs evolved into boroughs, their councils precursors to civic government. Winchester remained a spiritual and administrative capital, its street grid still reflecting Alfred's urban planning. Archaeologists, uncovering remnants of his fortifications, note how practical geometry and aesthetic harmony combined a literal map of his belief that beauty and utility should coexist. His cities were sermons in timber and stone. Even his use of time lived on. Monastic communities using candle clocks and water clocks, modeled after his divisions of the day, institutionalized his approach to balance equal measures of labor, prayer, and study. It is no exaggeration to say that the rhythm of English monastic life, and thus the cultural tempo of medieval England, pulsed to the cadence of Alfred's disciplined hours. In his method of ruling time itself, he had tamed chaos at its most abstract level. His influence extended into diplomacy as well. The treaties he negotiated with Guthrum, once born of necessity, became models for coexistence. They showed that peace could be forged without humiliation. The boundaries of the Danelaw, though temporary, introduced the notion of negotiated sovereignty, the idea that rulers could share land through law rather than endless war. This concept, centuries later, would underpin the emergence of legal borders across Europe. In Alfred's quiet diplomacy lay the first glimmers of international law. The further one looks, the more his influence multiplies. When later kings commissioned their own codes or reforms, they invariably claimed to be restoring Alfred's principles. Even tyrants sought legitimacy through his name. In the 12th century, Henry of Huntingdon called him the model of English kingship. In the 13th, Matthew Paris described him as a light kindled by God. By then, the epithet the Great had become inseparable from his name, a title earned not through conquest, but through construction. It is striking that his fame endured in such quiet ways. While conquerors like William or Edward Longshanks left monuments of fear, Alfred's monuments were habits. His spirit survived in record-keeping in parish schools, in the custom of balancing mercy with justice. Long after the Normans reshaped England's castles and cathedrals, they governed through systems he had made. The continuity of English governance, the rare ability to evolve without erasure, was Alfred's final victory. Even his human frailty became part of the legend's truth. The image of the sickly scholar king reminded later generations that endurance was not physical might, but moral constancy. For a people often buffeted by war, famine, and political turmoil, Alfred's example offered reassurance that quiet perseverance could outlast violence. He embodied the belief that civilization could be rebuilt not once, but endlessly. His name would echo through every English age of reform. The Reformation claimed him as a precursor for vernacular faith. The Enlightenment praised him as a rational monarch. The Victorians resurrected him as moral ideal. Yet beneath each appropriation, the essence remained the man who turned survival into structure, despair into design. If there is a single line that encapsulates his rise, it is this: Alfred transformed crisis into continuity. From the moment he fled to Athelney to the centuries that followed his death, everything he touched, education, defense, faith, and law, became a pattern for renewal. When the English built again after loss, whether from Viking fires or later wars, they were imitating him consciously or not. If Alfred's reign was the seed, then the century that followed was the flowering of everything he had sown. His reforms, laws, and vision became the invisible scaffolding that held England upright through upheaval. But even as later kings expanded his system and generations of chroniclers sanctified his image, the human story of Alfred, the father, the scholar, the sufferer, continued to glow beneath the gold leaf of legend. For those who ruled after him, invoking his name was both blessing and burden, a reminder that greatness was measured not in conquest, but in conscience. His children carried forward his balance of intellect and endurance. Edward the Elder ruled with the steadiness of a craftsman, continuing his father's design, fortifying burhs, and pushing the frontier northward. His sister, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, governed with a rare combination of strength and grace, completing the chain of defenses that enclosed the heart of England. Their coordination, the cooperation of brother and sister, in military and administrative command, was itself a living testament to Alfred's belief in ordered collaboration. Together, they turned defense into unification. Under Edward's son, Ethelstan, the idea of England matured into fact. For the first time in recorded history, the whole island south of the Scottish border acknowledged one crown. The burhs became royal boroughs, the laws became standardized, and coinage bore the inscription Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain. It was an audacious phrase, but its roots traced straight to Alfred's careful dream of coherence. The England that emerged under Ethelstan's rule was not born from sudden victory. It was assembled brick by brick from his grandfather's blueprint. In monasteries, the monks who still copied Alfred's translations saw the unification of the realm as divine vindication of his faith in learning. The moral logic of his reign, that wisdom and strength must grow together, became national dogma. Even military triumphs were framed in his vocabulary. The chroniclers who described Ethelstan's great victory at Brunanburh wrote their verses in Old English, in the literary tradition Alfred had made accessible to his people. His language, once a fragile experiment, had become the vessel of epic memory. Yet even as England prospered, the cycle Alfred had foreseen repeated itself. Peace bred complacency, and complacency invited danger. By the mid-10th century, Danish ambition revived. Raids returned along the coasts, though the burhs still stood strong. Alfred's system continued to defend long after his lineage waned, but the human vigilance that sustained it began to falter. The moral unity he had cultivated eroded under weak kings, and the chronicler's tone shifted from gratitude to lament. It was as though the kingdom had forgotten the fragility of its peace. Still, Alfred's institutions endured longer than any might have expected. His law codes, recopied and expanded, provided continuity through dynastic uncertainty. The very existence of written precedent, a habit he had instilled, kept the realm from dissolving into the anarchy that plagued other European states. Even when corruption returned to the clergy, his insistence on education gave reformers the intellectual tools to renew the church. When the Danes invaded again under Swine Forkbeard and Canute, they conquered a land too structurally stable to collapse. Ironically, the Danish kings who ruled England in the 11th century governed more like Alfred than their own ancestors. They relied on his legal order, his taxation systems, and his councils of advisors. Alfred's transformation of kingship had been so thorough that even his conquerors could not rule without imitating him. The Danes adopted his laws almost verbatim. They maintained his coinage and fortresses, and Canute himself, ruling from Winchester a century after Alfred's death, described his governance as in the English manner. The foreign king who once came from the same Viking world that had nearly destroyed Wessex, had become the executor of Alfred's design. No greater vindication of his philosophy could exist. The invaders had inherited the very order they once sought to erase. The Norman conquest of 1066, though brutal, did not erase Alfred's influence either. William the Conqueror's Domesday Survey, the great census of land and law, was built on administrative foundations Alfred had established 2 centuries earlier. The shires, hundreds and tithings he had systematized, became the skeleton for Norman governance. Even as castles replaced burghs and French replaced Old English at court, the practical habits of record rotation and taxation endured unchanged. Alfred's England was resilient precisely because it was rational. It could absorb conquest without losing coherence. In spirit, the image of Alfred evolved with each age. To the monks of the 12th century, he was a saintly scholar. To jurists of the 13th, the originator of English common law. To Renaissance humanists, a philosopher king like Marcus Aurelius. To Victorians, the moral patriarch of the nation. Each interpretation revealed as much about its age as about Alfred himself. Yet across all transformations, the core remained the notion of leadership, a stewardship of learning as armor, and of patience as strength. His translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy captured this essence best. In that text, written centuries before his time, Boethius asked why good men suffer misfortune. Alfred's rendering of the work was personal, intimate. He adapted it not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience. The king who once fled into the marshes found solace in the idea that wisdom, not fortune, defined greatness. That message resonated through English thought for centuries. It was echoed by medieval chroniclers, echoed by Shakespeare's kings, torn between conscience and power, echoed even in later philosophers who sought order in uncertainty. The English temperament, stoic, introspective, quietly defiant, bore the signature of Alfred's Boethian faith. His reforms also had a long afterlife in law and governance. The principle that rulers must act with counsel rather than by divine whim eventually evolved into Parliament. The concept of royal accountability, born in his insistence on moral justice, became a cornerstone of English constitutionalism. Every oath taken by kings thereafter, every charter promising lawful governance, was in a sense an echo of Alfred's humility. Even in modern legal thought, the balance between precedent and mercy owes its philosophical lineage to the ideals he set in motion. But perhaps the most poetic continuation of his legacy was linguistic. The English language itself, its rhythm, clarity, and accessibility, was Alfred's enduring monument. By translating Latin into the tongue of the common man, he elevated the vernacular from simplicity to dignity. The cadence of English prose, its plain strength, and measured tone was forged in his schoolrooms. Long after scholars forgot the exact words of his prefaces, they still wrote in his spirit, steady, moral, lucid, through the centuries when the English faced decline, whether from invasion, civil war, or cultural fracture. They returned instinctively to Alfred's model, learn, reform, rebuild. His example became the pulse of national renewal. Each renaissance of order, from the monastic reforms of the 10th century to the intellectual awakenings of later eras, began with the same quiet conviction he had lived by, that the mind was the truest fortress. By the high medieval period, More than 2 centuries after Alfred's death, his image had passed fully into legend. Yet what made that legend remarkable was how rooted it remained in truth. The myth of Alfred the Great was not the hollow glorification of a distant ruler. It was the reflection of a collective memory that still lived in the system's institutions and quiet habits he had left behind. His rise, once the story of a man, had become the ongoing rise of a nation, learning how to balance strength with reason and order with compassion. Monks continued to preserve his name in their chronicles, invoking him as Rex Doctissimus, the most learned of kings. But beyond the monasteries, his influence manifested in everyday life, in the steady hum of trade along roads he had once fortified, in the consistency of taxes levied by reeves whose offices he had defined, and in the civic councils meeting under borough charters that evolved from his burrs. Even the market's ringing churchyards on feast days reflected his fusion of the sacred and the practical. Alfred's England had been designed not as a monument, but as a living organism, and it was still breathing. The 11th and 12th centuries were turbulent. The Normans brought their language, their castles, and their feudal hierarchies, reshaping England's landscape almost overnight. Yet their rule, though brutal in conquest, rested upon foundations they could not replace. The Norman administration inherited Alfred's shire divisions, his record-keeping, his taxation networks, and his expectation that law must be written and preserved. Domesday. Book William's exhaustive survey of every acre and animal was an extension of Alfredian rationality. The conqueror's clerks used Latin ink, but they worked within a framework born from a Saxon king's candlelight calculations. The spirit of literacy Alfred had revived also proved indestructible. Even as French became the language of court English, persisted in the church and countryside, nurtured by clerks who still copied the old translations. The very survival of the English tongue through 2 centuries of Norman dominance owed much to the vernacular prestige Alfred had bestowed on it. When in the 13th and 14th centuries, English re-emerged as a language of government and literature, its tone-clear, rhythmic morale still carried his imprint. Chaucer's prose and later Wycliffe's Bible translations both echoed the simplicity and cadence first modeled in Alfred's works. In law, his influence deepened invisibly. The idea that the king himself was subject to law so radical in Alfred's time became a cornerstone of the English legal tradition. Magna Carta, signed in 1215, embodied principles he had practiced centuries earlier, that governance required consent, that justice must serve the common good, and that written charters preserved peace more effectively than oaths alone. When medieval lawyers spoke of the law of the land, they were describing a tradition that began with Alfred's fusion of custom and conscience. The fact that England never returned to the unchecked absolutism of other European monarchies was due in no small part to the moral restraint he had made synonymous with kingship. The church too still bore his shape. His insistence on literate clergy and accessible faith had democratized devotion in ways the Norman hierarchy could not fully reverse. English homilies simplified, and moral continued to reach parishioners long after Latin sermons had faded. The monastic schools that grew from his reforms became universities, Oxford and Cambridge, emerging in the 12th century as extensions of his educational vision. The medieval idea that knowledge was both sacred duty and civic virtue was pure Alfredian legacy, surviving quietly under changing regimes. By the 13th century, English chroniclers began to craft a genealogy of national identity that placed Alfred at its beginning. He was remembered not merely as the savior of Wessex, but as the founder of English civilization. His story of exile endurance and recovery offered moral structure to a people who had endured conquest but refused to lose themselves. In manuscripts illuminated by monks and historians alike, he appeared as a scholar, surrounded by candles, a warrior priest holding both book and sword. The duality defined not only his reign, but the self-image of the English for centuries to come. This duality also carried a warning. Even in prosperity, chroniclers return to the caution Alfred himself had voiced that nations fall when wisdom decays. The moral anxiety of later ages, the recurring English fear of decline, was inherited from him. His writings taught that learning and order were never permanent achievements, but disciplines to be renewed. Every generation, he believed, must rebuild its walls, both literal and spiritual. This philosophy of continuous repair became one of England's quietest strengths. It was visible in the pattern of English resilience that followed. Each time the realm faced upheaval, civil war, plague, reformation, or industrial revolution, it responded not with dissolution, but with adaptation. That habit, the instinct to reconstruct without erasing, was Alfred's final gift. He had embedded flexibility into the nation's identity. His idea of governance was not rigid perfection, but perpetual improvement, a recognition that order to survive must evolve. By the late Middle Ages, when Parliament had become a fixture of English life, its members invoked Alfred as the first lawgiver who had sought counsel before command. Statues and illuminations depicted him seated among advisors rather than enthroned above them. Even kings who wielded absolute power justified it by claiming to follow his example of righteous rule. His myth had become a mirror in which rulers measured themselves. The English language, now fully reborn, carried his tone into literature and prayer. The translators of the 1380 Wycliffe Bible, seeking words that ordinary people could grasp, drew unconsciously on Alfred's rhythm, plain syntax, short clauses, a moral cadence that guided comprehension. His quiet insistence that the Word of God should speak directly to the people had, after 5 centuries, become the foundation of English Christianity itself. As Europe entered the Renaissance, the humanist scholars rediscovered him anew. They praised his intellect as that of a philosopher in a barbarous age, a man who had anticipated the ideals of reason and education centuries before their rediscovery. They saw in him a prototype for enlightened monarchy, a ruler who governed not by divine whim, but by deliberate thought. The Reformation, too, adopted him as a patron saint of vernacular faith. Reformers like Cranmer and later translators of the English Bible cited Alfred's precedent for bringing scripture to the common tongue. The same courage that led him to translate theology into the people's speech had now become theological doctrine. Even as time marched on, the pattern held. Every intellectual awakening in England seemed to rediscover Alfred as though he were the perennial root of the nation's reason. The Victorians, obsessed with progress and moral order, erected statues to him, casting his image in bronze and marble. The most famous stood at Winchester, a solitary figure sword raised like a cross overlooking the city he had once rebuilt. Beneath it, an inscription called him England's shepherd and scholar. The choice of words was deliberate, not conqueror, not emperor, but shepherd, guiding, patient, enduring. By then, more than 900 years had passed since the boy from Wantage first memorized a book of poetry in his mother's hall. Empires had risen and fallen, languages changed, and yet the story of Alfred the Great still spoke with a strangely modern tone. His rise was no longer only history, it had become inheritance. The England of scholars, inventors, and lawgivers, the England that prized reason, moderation, and endurance, was in its bones still Alfred's kingdom,